The shocking and grotesque death of Henry VIII, a king undone. Henry VIII, the mighty Tudor monarch who defied the Pope, reshaped England's religion, and sent queens to the scaffold, met an end so appalling it's rarely spoken of in full. Behind the grandeur of his royal portraits and his fearsome reputation lay a tragic, grotesque decline into physical ruin and isolation. In his youth, Henry was the very image of a Renaissance prince. Tall, athletic, charismatic. But after a devastating jousting accident in 1536, everything changed. A leg injury that never properly healed turned into a festering, open wound. The ulcer emitted such a sickening stench that courtiers could smell him from rooms away, yet none dared react, for fear of angering the king. From then on, his health and mind spiraled downward. As the years wore on, Henry became monstrously obese, exceeding 400 pounds. He could barely walk and had to be hoisted between rooms with mechanical pulleys. His once-admired frame became so deformed that palace doorways had to be widened to accommodate him. Pain consumed him. Treatments of the time, bloodletting, cauterization, and the use of mercury and arsenic, only worsened his suffering. By the final months of his life in 1547, Henry's body was ravaged by gangrene and possibly diabetes, gout, and heart failure. His legs had rotted, and he spent days in delirium, muttering the names of his dead wives. The stench of death clung to him, yet no one dared admit he was dying, as predicting a monarch's death was considered treason. When he finally died at 55, the horror didn't end. His massive, bloated body was sealed in a specially made coffin, but the crude embalming methods failed. As his corpse decomposed, putrid fluids leaked from the coffin while it rested in the chapel, and according to chroniclers, stray dogs were seen licking the royal remains off the floor. This degrading end, so far removed from the king's image of divine authority and majesty, serves as a chilling reminder of mortality, power's limits, and the human body's inevitable decay. Henry VIII, who once ruled with unchecked might, died in agony, feared but unloved. His final chapter is not just a tale of death, but of downfall, dignity lost, and the cruel equalizer that comes for kings and commoners alike. From golden prince to rotting tyrant, the dark decline of Henry VIII. In the early 1500s, Henry VIII was the very embodiment of royal splendor. Towering in stature with striking red gold hair and a radiant smile, he dazzled foreign ambassadors and inspired awe across Europe. Known for his vigor in sport, music, and intellect, he was hailed as the ultimate Renaissance monarch, a vision of strength, health, and charm. But that image would not last. In January 1536, during a jousting tournament in Greenwich, fate dealt Henry a cruel blow. His horse toppled, and the king was crushed beneath it. He lay unconscious for hours, his courtiers fearing for his life. Though he survived, the incident left more than physical scars. His leg sustained a deep injury that would never fully heal. Over time, it transformed into a festering wound that refused to close, a chronic sore that emitted a putrid stench, turning the once proud king into a walking symbol of decay. The injury marked a sinister turning point. No longer able to ride or hunt, Henry grew increasingly sedentary. His appetite swelled, his waistline expanded, and his once trim frame ballooned into grotesque proportions. He grew irritable, suspicious, and increasingly ruthless. Some modern historians believe the trauma from the fall may have triggered or worsened neurological and psychological conditions, contributing to the paranoia that would define his later reign. As his body failed him, so too did his relationships. He lashed out at those closest to him, ordering executions with cold efficiency, even of wives and trusted friends. His court, once filled with music and laughter, became a place of whispers and fear. Behind closed doors, the king battled constant pain. Treatments of the day, primitive and brutal, only compounded his suffering. Infections worsened, and the ulcer on his leg became so noxious that his presence was dreaded. Servants were forced to endure the unbearable odor in silence, terrified of provoking his wrath. This slow, humiliating deterioration stood in stark contrast to the glory of his youth. Henry VIII, once seen as England's shining future, was now a tragic relic of a glorious past, rotting from the inside out, both physically and emotionally. The fall of Henry VIII is more than a story of illness. It's a chilling transformation from heroic monarch to a shadow of a man, one whose downfall mirrored the darker side of unchecked power. The madness of a king, how one fall unraveled Henry VIII's mind. Henry VIII wasn't just a king, he was a force. In his prime, he was bold, charming, and brilliant, commanding respect across Europe. But something changed drastically, and it may have started with a single fall. In 1536, during a jousting event, Henry was thrown from his horse and crushed under its massive weight. He was unconscious for hours. At the time, physicians could only treat the visible injuries, most notably, a serious leg wound that would become a lifelong ulcer. But modern experts believe something far more insidious happened that day, a traumatic brain injury. Soon after, the man once known for charisma and diplomacy began exhibiting frightening behavior. His temper flared unpredictably. He grew increasingly suspicious, cruel, and violent. Long-trusted advisors were executed on flimsy charges. Friends became enemies overnight. The same year as his accident, he sent his second wife and Boleyn to the scaffold, based on accusations that historians now widely consider false. Paranoia gripped the royal court. No one was safe. Even a glance or offhand comment could be twisted into treason. Henry's decisions became erratic, his moods explosive. He lashed out, convinced everyone around him harbored betrayal. This wasn't the calculated ruler of his youth. It was a man unraveling. Physically, he declined as well. Immobile from his wound and increasingly obese, Henry isolated himself from the world. His pain seemed to fuel his madness. Treatments of the time, leeches, toxic salves, and bloodletting only worsened his condition. Trapped in a body that betrayed him and a mind that turned on those he once loved, Henry became a tyrant shaped by fear. Court life turned cold and dangerous. Whispers replaced music. Laughter faded. Servants trembled in his presence, unsure whether today would bring favor or death. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was a ghost of the man who once embodied royal magnificence. His mental decline, possibly triggered by a single fall, altered the course of English history. The confident prince became a fearful despot, ruling with suspicion and brutality. And behind his crown, a broken mind hid in plain sight. Henry's story isn't just one of politics and power, it's also a chilling glimpse into how physical trauma can twist even the greatest of men. The king's appetite, how Henry VIII ate his way into ruin. By the end of his life, King Henry VIII no longer resembled the golden prince he once was. Gone were the athletic frame and dazzling smile that once captured Europe's admiration. In their place stood a man so massive that his courtiers had to redesign the royal palaces just to accommodate him. Henry's weight surged past 180 kilograms, nearly 400 pounds. His girth was so extreme that doorways were physically widened and a custom-built pulley system had to be installed to move him between chambers. Walking became nearly impossible. Standing for long periods? Out of the question. The king who once jousted and danced now struggled to even rise from his chair. Fueling this transformation was an insatiable appetite. Records from the royal kitchens reveal a shocking daily consumption. Roughly 5,000 calories, heavily skewed toward red meat. Lamb, venison, beef, boar, and game birds were staples. Plates arrived one after another, often piled with rich meat pies, and washed down with ale or wine. Vegetables, if served at all, were rarely touched. Fiber and moderation had no place in the king's diet. But this wasn't just a matter of indulgence, it was a slow-motion self-destruction. His eating habits, paired with inactivity due to chronic leg wounds, led to severe health problems, gout, hypertension, and possibly type 2 diabetes. His body began to fail him from every direction. Ulcers festered on his legs, causing unbearable pain. Infections set in. His breath became labored. His presence, once commanding, was now repulsive, literally. The odor from his decaying wounds was so powerful that courtiers could smell him long before he entered the room. Still, no one dared criticize the king. To question his health was to risk one's life. So the court kept serving meat, smiling through the stench, and bowing to a monarch imprisoned in his own body. Henry VIII's later years weren't just marked by tyranny. They were marked by gluttony, excess, and unchecked indulgence. The once mighty ruler became a tragic warning. That power without restraint can consume not just a kingdom, but the man who holds the crown. His fall wasn't only political, it was physical. And in the end, it was the weight of his own appetite that brought the king to his knees. Tortured by medicine, the agony of Henry VIII. In the twilight of Henry VIII's reign, the most powerful man in England became a prisoner to pain and to the brutal medical practices of his time. As his health deteriorated, so did the methods used to cure him, turning the once mighty king into a living testament to medical ignorance and royal denial. Henry's most notorious affliction was the festering ulcer on his leg, a wound that never healed after a jousting accident. But the treatments applied by his royal physicians only deepened the horror. With no knowledge of modern hygiene or infection, the doctors resorted to medieval remedies that now read like torture. Bloodletting was a frequent prescription. Believing that illness stemmed from imbalanced bodily fluids, physicians repeatedly drained the king's blood, weakening him further and offering no relief. Next came cauterization, searing the ulcer with hot irons in an attempt to cleanse the wound. The screams echoing through the palace must have chilled even the bravest of courtiers. But perhaps the most grotesque treatments involved topical applications, salves containing toxic substances like mercury and arsenic. These were smeared directly onto the open sores, poisoning the flesh and exacerbating the damage. Over time, the ulcer became so severe that witnesses claimed the bone was visible through layers of rotting tissue. The result? A stench so horrific it cleared rooms. His odor preceded him by several chambers, and courtiers were forced to mask their disgust behind perfumed handkerchiefs, careful never to offend a king, whose wrath could be deadly. Even his most loyal servants feared approaching him too closely, lest the smell trigger nausea or worse. Despite the escalating horror, no one dared challenge the royal doctors. Henry was still the sovereign, and criticizing his care or suggesting he was near death could be considered treason. So the treatments continued. So did the agony. Trapped in a decaying body and tormented by the very hands meant to heal him, Henry VIII's final years were a waking nightmare. The king who had reshaped religion and ruled with unshakable authority was reduced to a helpless figure, consumed by pain and betrayed by the best medical minds his empire could offer. His end was not just tragic, it was terrifying. A monarch brought low not by enemies, but by ignorance disguised as care. The Mad King, Henry VIII's final descent into darkness. As King Henry VIII approached the end of his life, the image of England's once vigorous monarch had all but vanished. In his place stood a bloated, pain-ridden figure gripped by suspicion, delusion, and disease. His physical ailments were terrifying enough: swollen joints, chronic infections, and failing organs. But it was his unraveling mind that cast the darkest shadow over his court. Modern historians suggest that Henry may have battled a combination of serious illnesses: advanced gout, which left him barely able to walk, congestive heart failure that caused labored breathing and fatigue, and possibly even type 2 diabetes, exacerbated by his overindulgent diet. While some speculate that he also suffered from syphilis, there's no conclusive evidence, yet the symptoms were eerily similar: mental confusion, personality changes, and paranoia. What is certain is that Henry's mental state decayed sharply. Once a charming Renaissance prince, he became a tyrant gripped by fear. He imagined plots everywhere: whispers in corridors, sideways glances, even silence could be interpreted as treason. His court was plunged into an atmosphere of dread, where no one, no matter how loyal, was safe. Old friends, trusted advisors, and even noble blood were no protection. In his final years, Henry ordered a series of brutal executions, some just days before his own death. Among the most shocking was Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a respected poet and nobleman, whose alleged threat was so minor it would barely merit concern in saner times. Others, like Thomas Cromwell before him, had once held Henry's complete trust, only to fall victim to his spiraling paranoia. The king became obsessed with the idea that he was being poisoned. Elaborate safety rituals were enforced. Every dish was tasted by multiple servants, and silverware was checked compulsively. These precautions didn't stem from logic, they were born of terror. By the end, Henry lived in a self-created prison of suspicion and pain. Courtiers feared not just his wrath, but the unpredictable swings of his mood. A single wrong word could end in a beheading. Thus, Henry VIII, the man who had torn a nation from the Pope's grasp, ended not as a ruler surrounded by respect, but as a broken man, consumed by fear of friends and foes alike. His mind, once sharp, became his final enemy. The rotting throne, Henry VIII's unspeakable final days. By the closing months of 1546, King Henry VIII was no longer the imposing figure who had once commanded Europe's attention. His body had become a prison, a bloated, immobile cell racked by infection and rot. The stench of decay preceded him, saturating the royal chambers with a foul odor that clung to walls, draperies, and servants alike. Gangrene had taken hold of his legs, turning once strong limbs into blackened sources of agony. Movement was nearly impossible. He had to be hoisted from bed to chair by a system of ropes and pulleys, his massive frame unable to support itself. Every shift sent waves of pain through his body. Even breathing had become a laborious task. And yet, no one dared speak the truth. In Tudor England, to even suggest that the king might be dying was considered treason. Physicians, courtiers, and family members all participated in a strange pantomime, pretending the monarch would recover, even as the signs of death became undeniable. His skin was discolored, his eyes sunken, and his body wept foul-smelling fluid from open sores. The court fell into a surreal silence. Servants moved in shadows, covering their faces with perfumed cloths to endure the stench, while nobles whispered behind closed doors, fearful that even a look of pity might be interpreted as disloyalty. The law hung heavy in the air, not just the law of the land, but the unspoken law of fear. When he spoke, it was often in delirium. He muttered names from his past: Jane Seymour, the wife who had died giving him a son, and Boleyn, the queen he had condemned. Whether these were fevered dreams or guilt-ridden hauntings, none dared to ask. Even in his ruin, Henry was still king. It wasn't until the very last moments that the reality of death could be acknowledged. Too weak to speak, Henry offered only a hand squeeze in response to a priest's question about his faith. That silent gesture was the final act of a king whose power had once seemed limitless. His body may have failed, but his presence still terrified. The room was quiet when he died, not out of reverence, but out of collective fear finally giving way to silence. A reign that had reshaped a nation ended with a whisper, and the unbearable smell of mortality. The last grip, Henry VIII's quiet exit from a life of noise. After decades of ruling with iron will and unshakable authority, King Henry VIII reached the end of his life not with royal fanfare, but with a frail, human gesture. On the cold morning of January 28, 1547, at age 55, the once mighty monarch slipped into death, his final act being a simple squeeze of another man's hand. By then, Henry's body was ruined. Bedridden, bloated, and barely conscious, he lay in his chamber at Whitehall Palace, surrounded not by cheering courtiers or triumphant banners, but by fear, silence, and the slow march of decay. Despite his obvious decline, few dared admit he was dying. It was treason, after all, to predict the king's death, another reminder of the oppressive control he had maintained to the very end. The only acknowledgement of reality came in the quiet summoning of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a longtime religious advisor and one of the few trusted souls left in Henry's circle. As Cranmer approached the dying king, the atmosphere was tense. Henry could no longer speak. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his eyes fluttered with the exhaustion of pain and fever. When asked whether he died in the Christian faith, Henry had no words left to offer. But his fingers, swollen and pale, managed one last act, a firm squeeze of Cranmer's hand. It was subtle, yet profound, a final confirmation of belief, a farewell, and perhaps a silent apology for a lifetime of contradictions. This was not the death of a warrior on a battlefield, nor the passing of a king surrounded by adoring family. It was a muted exit, marked not by spectacle, but by breathlessness. The man who had once declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, who broke from Rome, dissolved monasteries, and reshaped the religious life of a nation, met his end quietly in a darkened room. The grip of Henry's hand lingered as his body stilled. Those present did not cheer, nor weep openly. Fear of saying the wrong thing held their emotions hostage. But history would remember that moment. The tyrant, the reformer, the king, reduced to silence and gesture, humbled in death like every man before and after him. The king who leaped, the undignified afterlife of Henry VIII. For a monarch who demanded control in life, Henry VIII had none in death. When he breathed his last breath on January 28, 1547, the physical ruin of his body was only the beginning of the final chapter, one that would haunt England's memory and history books alike. As funeral preparations began, Henry's courtiers faced a gruesome challenge. His body, bloated from disease and decay, was so large that a special coffin had to be built to contain him. But even that proved inadequate. In an age before modern embalming, time and biology were cruel to the corpse of the once powerful king. Stored temporarily at Sion Abbey on the way to Windsor, the coffin began to fail. What followed became one of the most humiliating stories ever recorded about a European monarch. According to contemporary accounts, bodily fluids from Henry's decomposing remains seeped through the poorly sealed casket. During the night, those fluids reportedly dripped onto the stone floor of the Abbey chapel, where stray dogs, drawn by the scent, were seen licking the liquid from the floor beneath the coffin. To many, this grotesque image was symbolic. Henry, a ruler who had once defied the Pope, created his own church, and executed wives and allies alike, now lay humbled and leaking, his legacy literally dripping into history in the most vile manner imaginable. Chroniclers of the day could not help but record the incident, viewing it as divine irony. The mighty king brought low not by battle or treachery, but by rot and scavengers. Yet the show had to go on. On February 16, 1547, nearly 3 weeks after his death, Henry was finally buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, next to his third wife, Jane Seymour. She alone had given him a male heir, Edward VI, making her the wife he chose to spend eternity beside. Despite the pomp of the royal funeral, the smell lingered. Nobles covered their faces, not only in grief, but also to shield themselves from the stench. The image Henry tried to maintain, majestic, divine, untouchable, was long gone. In the end, Henry VIII's post-mortem disgrace became part of his legacy. His body, like his reign, left a permanent mark, visceral, unforgettable, and soaked in contradiction. The irony of Henry VIII, the legacy of a king obsessed with science. Henry VIII's death, marked by decay and humiliation, ultimately underscores the great irony of his life and reign. Obsessed with securing a male heir to solidify his dynasty, he fractured his kingdom, executed wives, and reshaped English religion in the relentless pursuit of a son who could carry on his name. Yet, as history unfolded, it was his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who rose to the throne, not the son he so desperately sought. Henry's obsession with fathering a male heir consumed his actions throughout much of his life. His many marriages were driven by this singular goal. His first 2 marriages, to Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, ended in turmoil and execution. He even broke away from the Catholic Church, founding the Church of England, simply to annul his marriage and remarry in hopes of producing a son. And yet, when Henry VIII died in 1547, his longed-for successor was not the son he envisioned, but his daughter, Mary. who would later be known for her tumultuous reign as Bloody Mary. But the real punch of fate came with the ascension of Elizabeth, Henry's second daughter, who would go on to become one of England's most iconic rulers. Elizabeth I's reign ushered in a golden age for England, one that Henry, in his quest for a male heir, could have never predicted. Henry's obsession with perpetuating his bloodline came at a great cost. His life became a series of dramatic and often violent decisions aimed at securing his place in history through his son. And yet, after his death, it was his daughters who would define the future of England, outliving him and his dynasty. His death thus symbolizes more than just the end of a tyrant's reign. It represents the ultimate limit of human power, showing that no matter how fiercely we fight for control, we are ultimately powerless over the most fundamental aspects of life: birth, death, and legacy. Henry VIII's story is a reminder that even the most powerful monarchs cannot escape the ironies of fate.